Welcome to History and Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends and subscribers and visitors to this channel, I continue my history series, History of Modern Russia, Episode 4. Episode 1 was about 1917, Episode 2 was about domestic politics in Russia 1918, Episode 3 was about south of Russia and Ukraine in 1918, and today I am beginning to talk about the frontline civil war in the East. Now, I distinguish between the frontline civil war and the government versus people civil war. Essentially, one could easily understand the difference if we look at the American Civil War or the war between the states. When a government has an army and is fighting another government, that's a frontline civil war. When a government is fighting the people, then it is a war of a government against the people. The example in American history is Sherman raid in Atlanta and Georgia, when the government general deliberate policy was to destroy local population and their assets and their estates, etc., etc. So when the Bolsheviks practiced Red Terror against the population, that is the kind of war which is the government against the people civil war in Russia. But my first attention is about the frontline civil war, which resulted in the, as I mentioned in the second video, the coup d'etat of Admiral Kolchak against the socialist government, the Komuch government in Siberia. We left at the point where on 11th of November 1918, the Germans capitulated and the World War I was over, and at exactly the same, or just a few days later, that the Minister of War in the joint Russian government led by the Social Revolutionaries was overthrown in a coup d'etat, and that began the stage 2 of the Russian frontline civil war. This time, the opponents were the central government in Moscow of the Bolsheviks and the Siberian government led by Admiral Kolchak in the Urals and Siberia. So the Kolchak forces are known in Russian history as the Whites, but they were not the only ones of the Whites. There were two, if not three, major offensives of the Whites, and the second one was of Denikin, and General Denikin, I will treat that later, and that's in the south, in Ukraine and south of Russia. I'll come back to it. But right now, we focus on the Eastern Theater, which is the Urals and Siberia, beginning with December 1918. So, the events were quite dramatic, and the first period from December 1918 to approximately March-April 1919 was a period of tremendous success of Admiral Kolchak. It started out with the so-called Perm operation. Perm is a city in the Urals, and in December 1918, General Pepelayev had a dramatic and extraordinary successful move and surrounded the Bolshevik forces and took as booty 40 trains with ammunition, requisitioned property, and the golden reserve of Russia, which fell into the hands of Admiral Kolchak. He also conducted a mobilization in the adjacent provinces, and within a matter of days or weeks, he had a 300,000 army ready to fight the Bolsheviks. And the population was welcoming the Whites or Kolchak forces to their extraordinary amazement, because the population was tired of requisitions, tired of Bolshevik Red Terror against the property owners, and anybody who had any connection to previous administration of the Tsar. Now, my thesis, which I propose in my book, Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Political Parties and Social Movements in Russia, my thesis is that the reason that Kolchak and later on Denikin were able to advance so quickly was due to the anti-Bolshevik rebellions in those areas. And those of you who doubt or who don't believe me or who have other interpretations, I invite you to open up my book and look at the sources. It's all documented, especially the Bolshevik terror, which relies on official documents found in the archives, such as letters of Lunacharsky, Minister of Enlightenment in Lenin's government, to Lenin, who describes how local peasants were waiting for Kolchak, that there were serious, huge uprisings in Kostroma and in all Volga areas because of Bolshevik terror and Bolshevik requisitions. So there was a link between the domestic uprisings and the advancement of the white or anti-Bolshevik forces. Now, the advance was quite successful in the first 3 months. So by April 1918, Kolchak was within 1 day's march to the Volga, and plans were for successful offensive to Nizhny Novgorod, and then to Yaroslavl, and then to Moscow. But this was not to be. So, for the reasons why it didn't go any further and began to collapse after 3 months of successes, and collapsed quite precipitously, as by July 1919, Kolchak's forces were behind the river Urals. That means that they already lost several hundred of kilometers retreating towards the industrial basin of the Urals. Now, I have absolutely fantastic and undeniable and reliable sources for what was going on under Kolchak and under the Bolshevik from the Americans. And these are the cables of General Graves, the commander of American forces in Siberia. A quick note as to what the Americans were doing there. It was not to overthrow the Bolsheviks, contrary to some assertions in Soviet history. The American troops were there, sent by President Wilson in 1918 to support the Czech Legion. Now, if you want to know what the Czech Legion was doing, watch my previous video, or actually video number 2, where I explain. They were there to secure the Allied transit of the Czech Legion to Vladivostok, and also to counterbalance Japanese forces in the Far East in case they had any annexation plans. In any case, the cables of General Graves are absolutely fantastic, and they always ended with this sentence, "Your obedient servant." Very interesting style, which is now forgotten. In any case, the ample documentation shows that the Red Cross officers and doctors have taken testimony to the mass executions of the peasants and priests and nobles and merchants, their photograph taken, report written, and all of that is in the American archives. Particularly gruesome was the execution of 100 workers in Motovilicha plant after the strike that they had against the Bolshevik rule in December 1918, just a couple of weeks before the city was taken by the forces of Kolchak. So Red Terror against population is well documented by any stringent observer, and these documents I cite in my book Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War. Now about the Kolchak government. The Kolchak government, and that again is by General Graves and a lot of his reports, was not really a government. It was a government that controlled just the capital, Yekaterinburg, and then they withdrew to Omsk. And it became a Siberian government. Essentially, it was not a government, but a bunch of atamans, and there's a Russian word for it, atamanshina, which means the rule of warlords. So this huge territory from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean of several thousand kilometers, it was not governed by any one government. They were local warlords who essentially did whatever they pleased. And most of the time, they were enriching themselves at the expense of local population. There were endless requisitioning and robbery and executions and corruption and theft on grand scale. And I cite several letters of General Graves about the corruption and theft by the white officers under General Kolchak, Admiral Kolchak. On paper, there was a 400,000 army, but in fact, no more than 50,000 were actually fighting the Bolsheviks. And the interesting fact is that the most reliable and the best units to fight the Bolsheviks to the end were those of workers from the Urals, who were from those factories that experienced Red Terror and execution by the Bolsheviks in November-December 1918. So the best way to represent the second stage of the Russian frontline civil war is a slow collapse of the Kolchak forces. And the only reason it was slow and not as precipitous as it could have been is because of the huge distances. It was a war along the railroads, and it took some time, and actually not that much time. So from the Urals in July to Irkutsk in December 1918, this is 6 months. And in this 6 months, the Reds pursued the Whites in that huge territory of several thousand kilometers from the Urals to Baikal, Lake Baikal, the city of Irkutsk. On January 4, 1920, Kolchak was arrested, tried, and executed. And the remnants of his forces retreated to Manchuria, and then many of them wound up in San Francisco, and they were called the Chinese Whites. As a matter of fact, in 1980, I spoke to some of these people in San Francisco. I spoke to an officer who was 80 years old, which means he was 20 in 1920. And I had some very interesting interviews of the conditions in Siberia under Admiral Kolchak. So to conclude, Kolchak regime showed one thing, that the hopes for the overthrow of the Bolshevik regime by an all-Russian government that was led by Kolchak were illusory. The Whites were not capable of uniting Russia against the Bolsheviks. They had a chance and they blew it. And they blew it primarily because of their hatred, because of their incapacity to unite all anti-Bolshevik elements. There was ample evidence, including General Graves, of random executions of anybody who had any connection to being a leftist. The Whites never distinguished between those who were Bolsheviks and those who were Menshevik and those who were socialist revolutionaries. For them, they were all socialists to be disposed of, and there were endless executions without any trial and without any evidence whatsoever. So the hatred of the leftists, something that would be seen again and again in the history of Europe and under Franco in Spain. This began with the Whites, their total inability to act as a unifying center to restore law and order, their incapacity to establish at least a functioning administration, this kind of a warlordism and collapse of any authority is unfortunately what happened in Siberia and led to a collapse of the white regime in the East. But this is not over, and I shall continue with the story of General Denikin and the story in the South in my next video. Thank you very much. Please subscribe to my Substack, where I have a transliteration of the text if you prefer to read it. And of course, if you want evidence and sources, go and get my book from Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War. Thank you and goodbye until next time.